She froze in the middle of the schoolyard, both hands clutching her throat. Her eyes were wide with panic. Lily? Jack understood what was happening before anyone around them did. Her breathing came in broken gasps, her small body shaking violently as if struggling against something unseen. Jack rushed forward, and when the beam of the infirmary flashlight shone deep into her throat, his heart seemed to stop. Something was moving. Alive. Call an ambulance. Now. But that was not the moment when everything began. And if Jack had arrived even a little later, this would have been a story no one was left to tell. The Greyhound bus pulled away as dusk settled in, leaving Jack Miller standing alone on the sidewalk with a faded military backpack slung over his shoulder. 8 years. 8 years ago he had left this town with his head full of ambition, and now he was back, no fanfare, no family waiting. The night security job at Maplewood Elementary was not what he had dreamed of, but it was all he could manage. The interview had lasted barely 10 minutes. The school principal had looked at him with an awkward sort of sympathy that made Jack want to turn around and walk out. "You served your country. That's something to be respected," the man had said, his voice full of appreciation. Jack nodded without replying. He didn't want that respect. He just wanted to be left alone. That first morning on the job, Jack arrived earlier than usual. Dawn was just breaking, mist still clinging to the maple trees. In a shadowed corner of the schoolyard, there was a small, motionless shape. Jack squinted through the iron fence. It was a child, sitting cross-legged at the base of an old oak tree, her back resting against the trunk. One hand clutched the collar of a blue sweater. Something wasn't right. There shouldn't have been any students here at this hour. Jack pushed open the gate and stepped into the yard. The girl didn't move. She didn't turn her head. She just sat there, staring at some distant point ahead of her. As he came closer, the morning light revealed her face, a small, pale face, lips pressed tightly together, dried tear tracks on her cheeks. But what made Jack catch his breath were her eyes. Those eyes did not belong to a first grader. They were eyes he had seen on faces in the darkness of the battlefield, the eyes of someone who had lost hope, the eyes of someone who had seen too much, endured too much. Jack knelt down, keeping a careful distance. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. She didn't answer. Her dark brown eyes slowly shifted to meet his gaze, and in that instant, something inside Jack, something he thought he had buried forever, suddenly stirred awake. Instinct. Not the instinct to fight, but the instinct to protect. Something he had long forgotten, ever since he'd had nothing left to protect. "Would you like me to call someone for you?" he asked. The girl gave a very slight shake of her head. Then, in a hoarse voice, as if it hadn't been used in days, she said, "I'm fine, sir." The words landed in Jack's chest like small stones, sending ripples outward. He realized then she was hiding. From someone, or from somewhere she didn't want to return to. Jack sat down a few steps away, leaning back against a nearby tree. He didn't speak. He simply sat there in silence, letting the space between them feel less threatening. 5 minutes passed. 10. Birds began to sing. The morning light grew warmer. Finally, she spoke again. "You're the new security guard, right?" "That's right," Jack nodded. "My name's Jack." "I'm Lily," she said. "Lily Carter." "Lily," Jack repeated, the sound of her name feeling fragile, almost breakable. "Why are you here so early?" Lily looked down at her hands. "I like it here better. At home, it's too noisy." Jack understood. He understood all too well. The noise could be anything: arguments, things breaking, the sound of storms inside a small house, and sometimes the silence that followed was even more frightening. "What about your parents?" he asked carefully. "My dad isn't here," Lily said evenly. My mum is very busy. She has to work a lot." A familiar story, too familiar. Jack looked toward the school gate. Soon the other children would arrive. Laughter and chatter would fill the yard again, and Lily would have to stand up, walk into the crowd, and pretend that everything was normal. "Just like him. You know," Jack said quietly, "I don't like noise much either. That's why I work the night shift." Lily looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Really? Really? Sometimes people need a quiet place to feel safe." She nodded softly, as if someone had finally understood her. Jack stood and held out his hand. "For now, I think you should go inside. It's getting light, and your classmates will be here soon." Lily hesitated, then placed her small hand in his. Her hand was icy cold, trembling slightly. Jack held it gently and helped her to her feet. As they walked toward the school entrance, Jack felt something shift inside him. The wall of ice around his heart had cracked, just a little, and through that crack, something, maybe hope, or simply a sense of purpose, was quietly seeping in. His war was over. But Lily's war, he realized, had only just begun. And this time, maybe he could do something about it. Jack couldn't stop thinking about Lily. For 3 nights after their encounter in the schoolyard, her face kept resurfacing in his mind, the emptiness in her eyes, the icy coldness of her hand. He tried to push it away, to focus on his work. But the harder he tried, the sharper the images became. In the end, he decided he had to do something. On Friday afternoon, Jack went to see Sarah Mitchell in the teacher's lounge. Sarah was Lily's homeroom teacher, a woman in her mid-30s with keen eyes and a warm smile. When Jack knocked, she was grading papers, her reading glasses perched crookedly on her head. "Hi, Jack." Sarah looked up, surprised. "Is something wrong?" "Miss Mitchell, I wanted to ask you about a student," Jack said carefully. "Lily Carter." The smile faded from Sarah's face. She set her pen down and motioned for Jack to sit. "Lily," she sighed. "I've been worried about her for a long time." Sarah opened a drawer and pulled out a thick notebook. "This is my observation journal for the students. Take a look." She flipped to a page with Lily's name. Jack read the neat handwritten notes. Week 1, September. Lily is lively, cheerful, actively participates in class activities. Week 5, October. Lily has become quieter, less interaction with classmates, often stares out the window. Week 8, November. Lily no longer turns in assignments consistently. At the parent-teacher conference, her mother did not show up. Phone calls go unanswered. Week 10, present. Lily arrives at school unusually early, often sits alone, refuses to join recess, shows signs of fatigue and anxiety. Jack clenched his jaw. "Have you reported this?" "I spoke with Principal Grant," Sarah said, irritation creeping into her voice. "Twice." "And?" Sarah looked down, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "He said I was overreacting, that many families here are struggling financially, and that we shouldn't interfere in their private lives unless there's clear evidence." Clear evidence? A fierce fire flared in Jack's chest. What counted as clear evidence? Waiting until it was too late? "Can I speak with Principal Grant?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. "Are you sure? He's not an easy man to persuade." "I'd like to try." Principal Grant's office was spacious, with oak bookshelves and a wall crowded with plaques and awards. "Mr. Miller, is that right?" Grant folded his hands on the desk. "What would you like to discuss?" "Lily Carter," Jack said plainly. "She needs help." Grant frowned. "Miss Mitchell has already reported her concerns. I'm monitoring the situation." "Monitoring?" Jack leaned forward. "The child is coming to school at dawn, sitting alone in the yard, avoiding everyone. Something is wrong." "Mr. Miller," Grant said, his tone patient but firm, "I understand that you care. But you must understand we can't intervene in every family just because a child is withdrawn. She may be going through a difficult phase. The family may be under financial stress. These things are not grounds for violating their privacy." "Privacy?" Jack felt the blood rush to his head. "What about her right to be safe?" Grant stood up, his expression stern. "Mr. Miller, I appreciate your dedication, but you were hired to secure the school, not to investigate students' personal lives. If you continue to overstep your role, I'll have to reconsider your employment." The words struck Jack like a slap. He stood, his hands clenched into fists. "I understand," he said, his voice trembling slightly. As he left the office, Jack felt his chest tighten. Those invisible walls, rules, procedures, bureaucracy were closing in on him, like toxic smoke on the battlefield years ago. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Memories surged back, cries for help, orders to retreat, the crushing helplessness of leaving someone behind, the guilt that gnawed at him day after day. And now it was happening again. The system was telling him, "Don't interfere, follow orders, let it happen." But this time, Jack was no longer a nameless soldier bound to commands. This time, he had a choice. That night, Jack sat in the security office, staring at the camera monitors. In his mind, 2 paths lay clearly before him. Comply, keep the job, keep the safety, let everything pass by. Or break the rules, confront the system, and possibly lose everything. But when Lily's image rose in his mind, her frightened eyes, her cold hand, Jack knew the answer. Some things matter more than keeping a job. Some things are worth fighting for. On Monday afternoon, Jack stood in the corner of the schoolyard, his eyes fixed on the main gate. Classes had ended half an hour earlier, but he was still there. He knew Lily wouldn't leave right away. She was always the last one to go, hesitating, stretching out each minute as if she didn't want to return to where she belonged. And just as he expected, a small figure appeared from the side door. Lily stepped out, an oversized backpack weighing down her narrow shoulders. She walked slowly, each step heavy and reluctant, her eyes fixed on the ground. Jack didn't call out. He moved closer quietly, keeping just enough distance so he wouldn't startle her. "Lily," he said, his voice low and warm. She stopped and turned around. When she saw Jack, there was a flicker of relief in her eyes, as if she had spotted a familiar face in a sea of strangers. "Mr. Jack," she whispered, "would you like to sit for a bit?" Jack nodded toward the stone bench beneath the maple tree. "Before you head home, I bought you a bottle of water." Lily hesitated, then gave a small nod. They sat side by side on the cold stone bench. Jack handed her a bottle of orange drink. She took it but didn't drink right away, just held it tightly in both hands, as if it were something precious. Jack didn't rush her. He simply sat there, letting the silence settle. He had learned this on the battlefield. Sometimes silence opens doors that words never can. 5 minutes passed. 10. A light breeze stirred, sending yellow leaves tumbling around their feet. Finally, Lily spoke, her voice hoarse. "Have you ever felt like you just can't talk?" Jack turned to look at her. "Yes, many times. Like something is stuck in your throat, and no matter how hard you try, it won't come out?" Jack nodded slowly. "Yes, I know that feeling." Lily stared down at her worn shoes, her lips pressed together tightly, as if she were wrestling with something inside herself. "Mr. Jack," she said very softly, "has it ever happened that people don't believe you?" The question made Jack pause. He drew a deep breath. "Lily," he said, turning fully toward her, meeting her eyes, "I believe you. No matter what you say, I believe you." Tears welled up in Lily's eyes. Not sobbing tears, but quiet ones, slipping down her cheeks like small streams finding a way out. She wiped them away quickly, as if embarrassed. Jack said nothing. He reached into his jacket pocket, took out a tissue, and handed it to her. Lily took it and wiped her face. Then, suddenly, she knelt down on the ground. Jack was about to ask what she was doing, but stopped when he realized. Lily placed her index finger on the dusty surface of the low iron railing. Slowly, carefully, she began to write. 1 letter, then 2, then 3. Jack bent down, his heart pounding in his chest. Pain. The letters were tiny and shaky, but unmistakable. A silent cry for help from a child who couldn't speak. Jack felt his heart tighten painfully. He knelt down so they were at the same level. "Where does it hurt?" he asked gently. Lily didn't answer with words. She placed her hand on her chest, not over her heart, but a little higher, near her throat. Jack understood. This wasn't a pain you could touch. It was deeper, a pain born of being silenced, of being forced to keep quiet. "You don't have to say anything," Jack said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I need you to know one thing. I'm here. I won't leave you." Lily looked at him, her eyes still wet. "Really? Really?" She nodded, then wiped the word from the railing with the palm of her hand, as if she wanted that secret to belong only to the two of them. Jack stood and held out his hand. Lily placed her hand in his, and they walked toward the gate together. But this time, her steps were no longer as heavy as before. Still slow, still filled with worry, but something had changed. A small, fragile spark of hope. When Lily had gone, Jack remained standing at the school gate, watching the small figure disappear around the corner. Inside him, a fire had been lit. Not a fire of anger, but one of resolve. He had received a new order, not from a superior, not from the system, but from his own heart. Protect Lily, no matter the cost. The bond between the aging soldier and the wounded child had been sealed, and this time, Jack would not let it break. That night, Jack didn't sit still in the security office. He opened his battered old laptop and began searching. Child help hotlines, youth protection organizations, volunteer lawyers. He didn't know what he would have to do next, but he knew one thing. This time, he would not stand by and watch. This time, he would fight. On Wednesday afternoon, Jack and Sarah stood in front of the last house on Maple Street. It was the address listed in Lily's school records, a one-story wooden house with faded paint, a moss-covered shingle roof, and a rusted iron fence. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and a trash bin lay tipped over near the walkway. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with worry. Jack nodded. "We need to know the truth." They stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked underfoot. Jack knocked 3 light, careful knocks. There was no answer. He knocked again, this time louder. "Sorry to bother you. I'm the security officer from Maplewood School. We're here to check on Lily Carter." A few seconds of silence, then the sound of shuffling footsteps from inside. The door opened a crack, revealing a man's face, skin darkened by grease and grime, an unshaven beard, deep circles under wary eyes. "What do you want?" The voice was hoarse, guarded. "You're Michael Carter, correct?" Sarah spoke up, gently. "I'm Lily's teacher. We'd like to talk with you about her." Michael studied them, his jaw tightening. "Is there something wrong with my daughter?" "Not a problem," Jack said. "We're just concerned. She's changed a lot lately." Michael stood still, as if weighing his options. Finally, he opened the door wider. "Come in." Inside the house, the smell of dampness and medicine hit Jack immediately. The living room was small and cramped, cluttered with worn furniture. Cracks spread across the walls like dead tree branches. A single old lamp cast weak light. Michael gestured toward a torn sofa. "Sit." Jack and Sarah sat down. Michael remained by the door, arms crossed, his posture defensive. "What kind of work do you do?" Jack asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "Auto repair," Michael replied shortly. "At Henderson's shop. 2 shifts." "2 shifts?" Sarah said, surprised. "Have to make enough money. My wife. She's not well." Michael glanced toward the dark hallway. "Hasn't been for 3 years. She can't work. The medication is expensive." Jack followed his gaze. At the end of the hallway, a small room stood partially open, a dim light spilling out. "May we see Mrs. Carter?" Sarah asked. Michael hesitated, then nodded. "All right." They followed him down the narrow hall. The last room, a small bedroom with an old iron bed. Lying motionless on it was a frail woman, prematurely grey hair tangled around a pale face. It was Rachel Carter. "Rachel," Michael said softly, "we have visitors." Rachel slowly opened her eyes. They were tired, but still held a trace of kindness. "I'm sorry, I can't get up." "That's perfectly fine," Sarah said, stepping closer. "We're teachers and staff from Lily's school. We came to check in." At the mention of her daughter's name, Rachel's face brightened then fell. Is she okay?" "She's trying very hard," Sarah said. "But we think she's carrying too much for her age." Rachel closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I know, and I can't do anything about it. Her mother lies here like a burden. She has to take care of me, cook, clean, and her father. Her father works day and night." Michael turned away, wiping his eyes quickly with the back of his hand. Jack felt his chest tighten. This wasn't the story he had expected. There was no villain, no abuse, just a family slowly sinking under poverty, illness, and helplessness. They returned to the living room. Michael collapsed onto a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice breaking, "that I'm a bad father, that I don't take care of my child. But I'm trying. I work myself to death. I don't want my daughter to live like this. I just don't know what else to do." "Have you applied for assistance?" Sarah asked gently. Michael gave a bitter laugh. "I did. They said we're not poor enough, not bad enough. How much worse does it have to get? Wait until my wife is gone? Until my daughter completely breaks down?" Jack clenched his teeth. The system. Again the system, with its rigid rules, endless paperwork, and hollow promises. "There's more," Michael said, his voice trembling. "I'm scared. Scared that if anyone finds out how things really are, they'll take my daughter away. Say I can't provide for her. And then what? Where would Lily go? A foster home? A stranger's house?" Tears streamed down his face, but Michael didn't wipe them away. He just sat there, shoulders slumped, like a man completely spent. Jack stood and stepped closer. He knelt down so he was level with Michael, looking him straight in the eye. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low but steady, "we're not here to take your daughter away. We're here to help." Michael looked at him, suspicion and hope mingling in his eyes. "Help? How?" "I don't know yet," Jack admitted. But we'll find a way. You're not alone anymore. Sarah nodded. We'll connect you with support organizations, with the hospital, with legal aid, and we'll keep a close eye on Lily at school, make sure she gets the support she needs. Michael looked at them, his lips trembling. Why? Why do you care? Jack gave a sad smile. Because I know what it's like to carry a burden alone, and I know what it's like not to be believed, but this time, things will be different. Michael nodded slowly, tears still falling. Thank you both. As they stepped outside, Jack and Sarah fell silent. The evening sky had turned a deep orange red. A cold wind blew, but Jack no longer felt chilled. He looked back at the house at the end of the street, the house where a family was fighting a war without guns or uniforms, but no less brutal. They need us, Sarah said quietly. Yes, Jack replied, and this time we won't let them fight alone. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the house at the end of the street came back to him, the cracked walls, the smell of dampness, Rachel's pale face lying motionless on the bed, and Lily's eyes carrying far too much worry for a 7-year-old child. When he finally drifted off around 3 a.m, the nightmare came. The desert sky was stained blood red. Wind howled through the ruins of shattered buildings. Jack was running, his feet sinking deep into the sand. Ahead of him, a small figure waved frantically. He tried to run faster, but the distance only grew. Then the figure collapsed and vanished into the smoke. Jack jolted awake, drenched in sweat. His heart pounded wildly. He sat up, clutching his head in both hands, struggling to steady his breathing. Dawn was breaking. A new day had begun. Thursday morning at Maplewood School unfolded as usual. Students streamed in, laughter and chatter filling the air. Jack stood at the edge of the schoolyard, scanning the crowd, searching for a familiar small figure. Lily arrived later than usual. She moved slowly through the gate, her face pale, her shoulders slumped. Jack noticed it immediately. Something was wrong. She staggered slightly, one hand clutching her throat. He hurried toward her. Lily, are you okay? Lily looked up at him. Her lips moved as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. Then suddenly she opened her mouth, gasping for air, but none would go in. Her eyes widened. Her hands flailed. She was choking. Time seemed to freeze. Jack lunged forward, catching her before she collapsed. Lily struggled in his arms, her fingers digging into his shirt, her face turning bluish. Stay with me, Jack shouted, his voice thunderous. Stay with me. He scooped her up and ran straight toward the school building. Everything around him blurred the cries of students, teachers shouting questions. There was only one destination, the nurse's office. His boots pounded against the tile floor. His heart raced. His breath came in sharp bursts. Past and present collided in his mind, wounded comrades, screams for help, blood and dust all superimposed over the small body fighting for air in his arms. No, not this time. Not again. He would not lose anyone else. The nurse's office. Nurse Jenkins, a middle-aged woman with sharp, attentive eyes, was preparing medication for another student. When she saw Jack burst in, she dropped everything at once. What's going on? She asked, already moving toward them. She can't breathe. Jack laid Lily on the examination table, his voice shaking. There's something in her throat. Nurse Jenkins checked immediately. She shone a flashlight into Lily's mouth, her eyes narrowing as she looked deeper. 5 seconds passed. 10. Her face drained of color. Dear God. What? Jack's fists clenched. There's a living creature deep in her throat. Nurse Jenkins quickly reached for medical tools. It looks like some kind of insect. It's blocking her airway. Jack felt the blood leave his face. An insect. Alive. Inside a child's throat. Do something, he shouted. Anything. Nurse Jenkins remained remarkably calm. She needs to go to the hospital immediately. I can't remove it here. Call an ambulance. Jack turned toward the door, but the nurse grabbed his arm. There's no time. You have to take her right now. The hospital is only 5 minutes away. Jack didn't hesitate. He lifted Lily, holding her upright to keep her airway as open as possible. Nurse Jenkins ran after him, carrying a first aid kit. Jack's old pickup truck tore out of the parking lot, gravel flying beneath the tires. He drove one-handed, the other arm steadying Lily in the passenger seat. Nurse Jenkins sat in the back, leaning forward, her eyes never leaving the child. Slow breaths, sweetheart, the nurse said gently. Easy. Try not to panic. Lily nodded weakly, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was still conscious, that was the most important thing, but every breath was labored, accompanied by a faint wheezing sound, like a distant train whistle. Jack floored the gas. Red lights, he ran them. Traffic, he wove through it. There was only one thought in his mind: the hospital. Get her somewhere safe. 5 minutes stretched like 5 hours. But at last, the hospital came into view, tall, white, with the emergency sign glowing red. Jack screeched to a stop right at the entrance, not bothering to park. He lifted Lily out and ran straight into the emergency room. "Help me," he shouted. "This child needs help now." The medical team responded instantly. Doctors, nurses, a gurney. They took Lily from Jack's arms, placed her on the stretcher, and rushed her through the doors. Jack stopped at the entrance, watching the gurney disappear behind the glass doors, his chest aching. Nurse Jenkins placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did everything right. She's going to be okay." Jack didn't answer. He sank to his knees on the floor, head bowed, his entire body shaking. The tears he had held back for so long finally fell, not tears of weakness, but the tears of a man who had fought with everything he had. The hospital corridor was as quiet as a church in the middle of the night. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh white glow, illuminating the weary faces of those waiting. Jack sat on a hard plastic chair, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the gleaming tile floor. 2 hours had passed since Lily had been taken into surgery. 2 hours that felt like 2 centuries. Beside him, Nurse Jenkins sat in silence, holding a cup of cold coffee. Sarah had returned to the school to take care of work matters, promising to come back later. And Michael Carter, Lily's father, stood by the window at the far end of the hall, his back to everyone else, his shoulders trembling at intervals. The operating room doors opened. A doctor stepped out, removing his mask. His face was tired, but there was relief in his eyes. Jack jumped to his feet. Michael turned around, his eyes bloodshot. "The surgery was successful," the doctor said. "We were able to remove the foreign object. She's recovering now, but she'll need to be monitored for a few more days." Michael sagged forward, bracing himself against the wall with both hands. His shoulders shook like waves after a storm. My daughter will be okay, right?" "Yes," the doctor nodded. "But I have to be honest, if this had been delayed even one more day, the consequences would have been very serious. The object caused a severe infection and damaged the lining of her throat. How long has she been suffering from this condition?" Michael fell silent. Jack stood beside him, feeling the weight of that silence like a stone pressing against his chest. About 3 weeks, Michael finally said, his voice catching in his throat. The doctor frowned. 3 weeks? Why didn't you bring her in sooner?" "I didn't know," Michael said, tears streaming down his face. "My child didn't say anything. She stayed quiet. I thought it was just a cold, just fatigue. I don't have the money to take her to the doctor every time she coughs." The doctor sighed. "I understand your situation, but this is a serious case. I'm required to report it to Child Protective Services." The air seemed to freeze. Michael lifted his head, his eyes wide. "No, please don't. Please don't take my child away." "Mr. Carter," the doctor said, his tone patient but firm, "this is procedure. When a child comes in with a condition like this, we have to determine whether there are signs of neglect." "Neglect?" Michael shook his head violently. "I'm not neglecting my child. I work 2 shifts every day. I do everything I can. I just don't have enough money." His voice broke. Michael collapsed onto the floor, clutching his head with both hands, sobbing, not loud sobs, but the quiet crying of a man who had carried too much for far too long. Jack knelt beside him. He placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, feeling his body shake. "You're not alone," Jack said softly. "We're here with you." An hour later, 2 social workers arrived, a middle-aged woman named Helen Briggs and a young man named David Thornton. They carried clipboards, paperwork, and the serious expressions of people who had witnessed too much tragedy. Miss Briggs sat across from Michael in a small counseling room. Jack was allowed to remain as a witness. "Mr. Carter," Miss Briggs began, her voice neither harsh nor warm. "We need to clarify your family situation. What is your wife's current condition?" "My wife is ill," Michael said hoarsely. "For 3 years now. She can't work. She needs constant care. Who looks after her when you're at work?" Michael said nothing. The answer was already clear. "Lily," Miss Briggs said for him. "A 7-year-old child caring for a bedridden mother. There's no one else," Michael replied, his voice heavy with guilt. "We can't afford to hire help. I have to work. If I don't work, there's no money for medicine or food, Miss Briggs wrote on her clipboard. Do you understand that this constitutes child neglect? A child should not have to carry adult responsibilities. I know, Michael shouted, then lowered his voice. I know, but I had no other choice. The system didn't help us. I applied for assistance, they denied us. I asked for medical support. They said we weren't poor enough. So what was I supposed to do? Miss Briggs sighed. Mr. Carter, I understand your circumstances, but our duty is to protect children. We'll need to assess whether Lily is safe returning home. Safe? Michael looked at her, his eyes red. My house is poor, but it's not dangerous. My child is loved. She's cared for. We just don't have money. Jack could no longer stay silent. Miss Briggs, he said, I've been to this family's home. I've seen the situation. This is not intentional neglect. This is a family drowning in poverty and in need of support. Miss Briggs looked at Jack. And who are you? I'm the school's security officer, the one who first noticed Lily's condition. I'm also the one who brought her to the hospital. Then you know how serious her condition was. A child should never have to endure that. Yes, Jack nodded. But removing her from her family won't solve the problem. What this family needs is support, financial, medical, social, not to be torn apart. Miss Briggs was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'll take that into consideration, but Lily will need to remain in the hospital during the investigation, and if we find any signs of abuse or severe neglect, we will intervene. Michael lowered his head, no longer having the strength to argue. After the social workers left, Jack and Michael sat in silence in the hallway. The fluorescent lights were still glaring white, but now they felt like torches burning away the last of their hope. I ruined everything, Michael whispered. My child just survived, and now they want to take her away. Jack didn't know what to say. A bitter feeling rose in his chest, not the bitterness of defeat, but of the cost. They had saved Lily from death, but now another threat loomed, the possible destruction of her family. And Jack wondered if he had acted sooner. Could things have turned out differently? Room 304 was bathed in the soft yellow light of late afternoon. Lily lay on the white hospital bed, her head resting on a plush pillow, a clean white bandage wrapped around her neck. Her eyes slowly opened, still unfocused from the anesthesia. Michael sat beside her, holding his daughter's small hand tightly. Sweetheart, Daddy's here. Lily looked at him, her lips trembling. Her voice was hoarse and painful, but the word finally came out. Dad. Michael broke down. He bent forward, pressing his forehead to her hand. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, my baby. Jack stood in the corner of the room, watching the scene with his heart clenched tight. This was a moment of reunion, a moment every family longs for, but he knew that just beyond that door, a threat was waiting. And right on cue, there was a knock. Helen Briggs entered, followed by David Thornton. She carried a thick file folder in her hands. Mr. Carter, Miss Briggs said, her tone patient but unyielding. We need to talk about the next steps. Lily startled at the unfamiliar voice. She turned her head, staring at the two strangers with wide, anxious eyes. Who are they, Daddy? She asked, her voice shaking. They're people who want to help you, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Briggs stepped closer to the bed, trying to sound gentle. Lily, my name is Miss Briggs. I'm from Child Protective Services. I'm here to make sure you're safe. Safe. Lily looked at her, then at her father. I am safe. I'm with my dad. We know you love your parents, Miss Briggs said, but sometimes, to receive better care, a child needs to stay somewhere else for a short time. Somewhere else. The words struck like thunder. Lily tightened her grip on her father's hand, tears filling her eyes. No, I don't want to go anywhere. I want to go home. Lily, sweetheart. Michael tried to stay calm, but his voice cracked. Miss Briggs sighed. Mr. Carter, this isn't an easy decision, but after reviewing your family's situation, we believe Lily needs to be placed temporarily with a foster family while you stabilize your circumstances. No, Lily cried out in terror. She searched the room desperately until her eyes found Jack. Mr. Jack, please don't let them take me away. Jack sprang to his feet. Inside him, a decision had already taken shape, clear, firm, and irreversible. He stepped forward, placing himself between the hospital bed and the social workers. Miss Briggs, I'd like to say something. Miss Briggs frowned. Mr. Miller, this is a professional decision. I understand you care, But I'll take responsibility, Jack interrupted, his voice steady. The room went silent. Responsibility, Miss Briggs repeated. Yes, I'll act as the supervising adult for this family. I'll visit daily. I'll make sure Lily is properly cared for. I'll connect them with medical, financial, and social support services. And I'll report directly to your agency. Miss Briggs studied him skeptically. You're not a relative. You have no legal standing. I'm a veteran, Jack said. I served for 8 years. I understand duty. I understand commitment. And I'm telling you, if you give this family time, I will make sure things change. Miss Briggs fell silent, thinking, Mr. Thornton leaned in and whispered something to her. Mr. Miller, Miss Briggs said at last, this is not a simple decision. We can't rely on promises alone. Jack took a deep breath. It was time. Time to strip away the armor and expose the wound he had hidden for 8 years. I understand, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I know promises don't mean much, so let me tell you a story. Jack turned toward the window. The evening sky was painted orange and red, just like the skies he had once seen far from home. 8 years ago, I left this country believing I was doing the right thing, he began. I wanted to protect others. I wanted to be a hero. But war, it isn't what you imagine. He paused, swallowing hard. I watched my friends, the men I ate with, slept beside, fought alongside, slowly lose the light in their eyes. Some never came home, some came back, but they were never the same. Michael looked at Jack, his eyes wet. Lily lay quietly, listening. One night, Jack continued, his voice breaking, we were ordered to retreat, but one of our men was trapped. He called for help. I heard his voice over the radio, but orders were orders. We had to pull back, and I obeyed. Tears streamed down Jack's face, but he didn't wipe them away. I survived. He didn't. And from that day on, I've lived with the guilt that I abandoned someone, that I didn't have the courage to break the rules and do what was right. He turned back, meeting Miss Briggs's eyes. Today, I'm standing at that same crossroads. The system is telling me to follow procedure, to let things run their course. But if I do, I know exactly what will happen. Lily will be taken from her family, the only family she has. And no matter how good the placement, no matter how kind the care, something inside her will break. Forever. His voice shook. I can't let that happen. Not again. I failed once. This time, I will fight. Silence filled the room. Miss Briggs looked at Jack, her expression no longer cold. Something perhaps understanding flickered in her eyes. Mr. Miller, she said slowly, you've been through a great deal, but this isn't a battlefield. That's true, Jack nodded. But this little girl is fighting her own war, and if we take her from her family right now, we won't save her. We'll destroy her. Miss Briggs looked at Lily lying in the bed, clutching her father's hand, eyes brimming with tears. Then she looked at Michael, the trembling father, waiting for judgment. Finally, she exhaled. All right, we'll give this a chance. 30 days. During that time, Mr. Miller will act as supervisor. If conditions improve, we'll reevaluate. But if there is any indication that Lily is not safe, we will intervene immediately. Jack nodded. I understand. Thank you. When the social workers left, Michael stood and walked over to Jack. He said nothing, he simply wrapped Jack in a tight embrace, the embrace of a man clinging to his last lifeline. Thank you, Michael whispered. Thank you for not abandoning us. Jack patted his shoulder gently. We'll get through this together. On the first Saturday morning, Jack stood in front of the last house on Maple Street beside a pickup truck loaded with building supplies. At his side were Sarah, Tom Wilson, an old friend from his military days, and a group of volunteers from the local community. All right, everyone, Jack said, his voice carrying in the cool morning air. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but I believe that together we can turn this house into a real home. Tom, a tall man with a thick beard, clapped Jack on the shoulder. You called the right people, Jack. We're going to make something special happen. They got to work. Hammers rang out. Saws cut through the air. The smell of fresh paint spread around them. Hands worked together to seal cracks, replace rotting boards, and scrub every corner of the house clean. Michael stood on the porch, watching strangers repair his home, his eyes red with emotion. He stepped down and picked up a hammer. Let me help, he said. Jack nodded. We'll do it together. Meanwhile, Sarah connected the Carter family with a volunteer attorney, Martha Hendricks, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp, perceptive eyes. She arrived that afternoon carrying a thick briefcase. "I've reviewed your family's case, Miss," Hendricks told Michael in the freshly cleaned living room. "You're eligible to apply for emergency medical assistance for your wife. I'll help you file the paperwork and make sure it's processed as quickly as possible." Michael nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I've tried so many times, but I didn't know how." "That's why I'm here," Miss Hendricks said with a gentle smile. "The system is complicated, but with guidance, it becomes manageable." At the same time, a volunteer doctor from the hospital, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, came to examine Rachel. She was a young woman with a warm smile and capable hands. "Mrs. Carter, Doctor," Rodriguez said gently after the examination, "your condition is serious, but it isn't hopeless. We'll need a new treatment plan, combined with physical therapy. I'll arrange for home-based care." Rachel wept, gripping the doctor's hand. Thank you so much." A week passed. The house at the end of the street changed day by day. The walls were repainted a soft, pale yellow. New windows were installed, letting in streams of sunlight. The front yard was cleared, weeds trimmed away. The old fence was repaired and repainted a bright white. Tom and the volunteers worked tirelessly. So did Jack, arriving early, leaving late, hammer and saw in hand, his shirt soaked with sweat, a smile never leaving his face. Sarah brought food every day, warm, home-cooked meals, fresh pastries, bottles of fruit juice. She sat with Rachel, talking, listening, offering a warmth the woman had long been without. Michael was offered a new job, more stable, better paying at Tom's auto shop. He no longer had to work 2 shifts. He could come home early. He could have dinner with his daughter. And Lily? She was discharged from the hospital after a week. When she stepped into the renewed house, her eyes widened in disbelief. This is my house, Dad?" she asked, her voice still hoarse but filled with wonder. Michael knelt and hugged her tightly. "That's right, sweetheart. This is our home, and now it's better." Lily looked around, tears welling up. Then she spotted Jack standing in the corner, holding a paint tray. "Mr. Jack!" She ran over and wrapped her arms around his leg. Thank you so much." Jack knelt down and gently brushed her hair. "You're welcome, kiddo. I just wanted you to have a beautiful home." 2 weeks later, Jack sat in the Carter family's living room, now furnished with a new sofa, a warm rug, and Lily's drawings hanging proudly on the walls. Michael poured tea and handed him a cup. "You changed our lives," Michael said sincerely. "Not just the house. Our hope." Jack shook his head. "It wasn't just me. It was the community. All of us." "But you were the one who started it," Michael insisted. "You're the one who didn't walk away." Jack fell silent for a moment, looking out the window as the sunset cast a golden glow across the room. He thought about everything that had happened from the first night he met Lily in the schoolyard, to the moment she couldn't breathe, to the fight with the system, and now to this quiet renewal. He realized something then. In helping the Carter family piece their lives back together, he had also repaired the broken pieces of his own soul. He was no longer a lone soldier carrying guilt and memories. He was part of a community. He was accepted. He was loved. That evening, Lily sat beside Jack on the porch, gazing up at the stars scattered across the sky. She held a picture book, practicing her first words again after her recovery. "Mr. Jack," she said, her voice still rough but much clearer now, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Jack smiled. "Why did you help us? You didn't even know us before." Jack looked at her, thinking for a moment. "Because I know what it feels like to be left behind, and I didn't want you to ever feel that way." Lily nodded, as if she understood. Then she placed her small hand on Jack's. "So, you're not left behind anymore, are you?" Jack felt warmth spread through his chest. "No, sweetheart, I'm not left behind anymore." They sat there in silence beneath the starlit sky, 2 hands, one large, one small, holding tightly. And in that moment, Jack knew he had finally found what he had been searching for over the past 8 years. Not victory, not heroism, but it is connection. It's about family. 1 year later, the auditorium of Maplewood Elementary was filled with bright lights and lively chatter. Rows of seats were packed with parents, teachers, and students. On the stage, a large banner read, "End of Year Assembly. Congratulations to our students." Jack sat in the back row, neatly dressed in a white shirt, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Beside him were Sarah, Michael, Rachel, who could now sit upright thanks to consistent physical therapy, and Tom with his wife. "Will she be okay?" Rachel whispered, gripping her husband's hand. "She'll be fine," Michael reassured her. "She's practiced many times." Principal Thompson stepped onto the stage, his voice echoing through the microphone. "And now, we will hear a special speech from a second-grade student, Lily Carter. She will be speaking on the topic, My Hero." The stage lights brightened. Lily walked out from the wings taller now, her hair neatly tied back, wearing a simple white dress. In her hands was a sheet of paper filled with uneven handwriting, but written with care. She stood at the microphone, trembling slightly. But when her eyes found Jack at the back of the auditorium, a small smile appeared. Lily took a deep breath and began to read. Her voice was still a little hoarse, a lingering effect of the surgery a year earlier, but every word was clear and steady. "My hero," Lily read, "doesn't wear a cape. He doesn't fly. He doesn't have superpowers." The auditorium fell silent. "My hero is the school security guard, Mr. Jack Miller." Jack felt his heart tighten. He looked up at the stage, unable to take his eyes off her. "A year ago, I couldn't speak," Lily continued, her voice quivering. "I was in a lot of pain, but I didn't know how to ask for help. I thought no one cared. I thought no one would listen." She paused, swallowing hard. But Mr. Jack listened, not with his ears, but with his heart. He saw me when I was hiding. He stood by me when I was afraid. And he didn't leave me, even when people told him he should. Tears streamed down Lily's cheeks, but she kept going. "He taught me that even when life is hard, there are still kind people. Even when you can't speak, someone can still hear you. Even when you think you're weak, you can be strong." She looked straight at Jack, her voice filled with emotion. "Mr. Jack didn't just save my life. He saved my family. He gave us hope when we thought everything was over. And now, our house is better. My mom is healthier. My dad is happier. And I can talk again." Lily smiled through her tears. "A hero doesn't need a cape. A hero just needs a brave heart and hands ready to help. Thank you, Mr. Jack. You are my hero. And I will never forget you." The auditorium erupted in applause. Many people stood, clapping for a long time. Rachel wept openly. Michael held her tightly. Sarah wiped away tears, smiling brightly. As for Jack, he remained seated, not because he didn't want to stand, but because he couldn't. His legs felt heavy. His chest was full of emotions he couldn't put into words. He looked at Lily on the stage, the child who, a year earlier, had sat silently beneath a tree, clutching her collar, eyes filled with fear. And now she stood there, her voice ringing out, her eyes shining with hope. This was not one person's victory. It was a victory for everyone, for the community, for compassion, for faith. And in that moment, Jack Miller, the soldier who had carried unseen wounds for 8 long years, finally found peace. He smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. His first true smile in 8 years. After the assembly, Lily ran down and threw her arms around Jack. "What did you think of my speech, Mr. Jack?" Jack knelt, so they were eye to eye. "It was wonderful, Lily. I'm very proud of you." "I'm proud of you too," Lily said with a smile. Michael and Rachel came over. "Mr. Miller," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, "we don't even know what to say anymore. You changed our lives." Jack shook his head. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us." Rachel placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "But you were the one who started it, and that means more than you know." That afternoon, Jack walked out through the gates of Maplewood Elementary. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across the road. Children ran and played in the yard, their laughter filling the air. He stopped and looked back. The school, once a place where he hid in the darkness, where he sought solitude and silence, had become the place where he found light. The darkness was still there, in the past, but it no longer clung to him. He had moved beyond it. He had left it behind. Jack looked ahead. The road stretched on beneath the warm sunlight, and this time, he wasn't walking alone. He had Sarah, Tom, the Carter family, the community. He had truly come home. Not a home of bricks and concrete, but a home built of love and connection, a home where he belonged. Jack walked on, shoulders straight, head held high. The scars on his soul were still there, but they had healed not completely, but enough for him to live, to love, to hope. And as he passed through the school gates, the evening sun shone on his back, a soldier who had found a new mission, a protector who had found meaning, a hero without a cape. A hero with a brave heart and hands ready to help. The story of Jack and Lily is a gentle yet powerful reminder that sometimes what makes a hero is not a glorious victory or extraordinary strength, but the choice to stay when others turn away, to stay and listen to silence, and to stay because a small, fragile life is still worthy of protection. Jack did not save Lily with weapons or commands, but with patience, courage, and a heart willing to break through the invisible barriers of fear and bureaucracy. And in the process of saving a child who was suffocating in silence, he also saved himself from guilt, from isolation, and from a past that had never fully healed. Every day, somewhere around us, there are still Lilies trying to survive quietly, and Jacks moving through life exhausted, unaware that they still have the power to heal others and themselves. If this story has touched you, consider subscribing to continue walking alongside stories about people, about kindness, and about small moments that are powerful enough to change an entire life. Please share this story with those you love, because the more people learn to pause, to truly listen, and to choose to stand with one another in the hardest moments, the more children will be protected, the more families will be kept whole, and the more wounded souls will find healing. And if you are going through a dark season in your own life, please remember this: you are not weak for needing someone, and you are not alone. There is always a hand ready to reach for yours if you allow it. Don't give up, don't turn away from silence, and never underestimate the power of staying.